This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Ebenezer Baptist Church, and we welcome our sister Angela Davis to the home church of Martin Luther King Jr. Welcome. We are a Baptist church, but I know that God is worshiped in many houses, known by many names. Would you join hands with your neighbor? And now, gracious God, for the gift of this moment, we are grateful. We thank you for the person whose hand we hold. Join us together now in a community of shared struggle and solidarity on behalf of the one who is the God of love and justice. And let the people of God say amen. Amen. Once again, welcome to Ebenezer Baptist Church. To be honest with you, Dr. Davis, during or after church actually, Sunday, I'm glad to say that it was a visitor to the Ebenezer Church and not a member who asked me, how in the world could you invite Angela Davis to Ebenezer Baptist Church? And I said, well, the question really should be phrased differently. How could I not invite Angela Davis? We are glad to join with Emory University and its Center for Women in inviting her to Atlanta, Georgia. She is here because we are clear that our faith is a freedom faith. Our faith has always been one connected to the struggle for liberation and justice and the dignity of humanity. This is the Church of Martin Luther King Jr. This is the church pastored by his grandfather, the second pastor of this church, A.D. Williams, who was fighting for justice at the turn of the century, who was engaged in establishing the National Urban League and the NAACP here in Atlanta, who fought for a decent school for colored children, that's what we were in those days, to attend. And from that school, Christine King Farris graduated, and Martin Luther King Jr. attended the school that his grandfather fought for. This is the church of Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr., who fought for the equalization of teachers' salaries and who led a voting rights campaign right here in the heart of the Confederacy in 1935, 30 years before the voting rights law. And on that foundation, not having sprung out of nowhere, but on that foundation, Martin Luther King Jr. stood. And so how could we not have Angela Davis? I can't think of a better place for her to be in Atlanta than here, because it was the courage and the analysis and the activism of Martin Luther King Jr. and others like him that inspired a young Angela Davis and stirred up something in her soul, a fire that has been burning now for the last little while. My mama didn't raise no fool. And so we're glad to be here, and we are inspired by her. Let me say this, and I'm done. St. Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, one of the fathers of the church, said that hope has two lovely daughters. He said they are both lovely, anger and courage. Anger with the way things are, and courage to make sure that things do not remain as they are. Hope has two lovely daughters. And so I've got a feeling that even as we struggle against racial injustice, and even as we struggle against sexism and misogyny and all of the other isms that divide us, and even as we struggle against America's growing prison industrial complex about which she speaks and writes so eloquently and clearly, that there is a lot of hope in this room. And so, Angela Davis, thank you so much for your analysis. Thank you for your anger. Thank you for your courage. And thank you for your activism. We need your voice. We need the ways in which you connect activism to analysis. You need analysis to know what to do. In order to engage in activism, you need analysis, and then your activism ought to take you into deeper analysis. And then your analysis, like Martin Luther King Jr., ought to take you into deeper activism. So once again, welcome to Ebenezer Baptist Church. Welcome to Atlanta. God bless you, my sisters and my brothers.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Warnock, for that warm welcome. Thank you for reminding us about hope and hope's daughters, anger and courage. I'm Lynn Huffer, chair of the Department of Women's Studies at Emory University.
And I'm Donna Yarbrough, the director of the Center for Women at Emory. We're thrilled to present you with the 2009 Emory Women's History Month keynote event, An Evening with Angela Davis. This event is actually the culmination of two separate series. First, the Emory Women's History Month with our theme, Women in Their Environments. And then secondly, the Atlanta Consortium of Colleges and Universities series, Motherhood at the Intersection of Race and Class, Resilience in the Face of Diversity, that was spearheaded by the Race and Difference Initiative at Emory.
Many partners have also made this event possible, and we'd like to extend our thank yous by highlighting first two very important people without whom this event would not have been possible. The first is Mr. Richard Glasser, whose generosity led to the creation of the Jessica Glasser Memorial Lecture Fund, inaugurated in 1998 in memory of Mr. Glasser's daughter, Jessica. Jessica Glasser graduated from Emory University with high honors in women's studies and political science in 1996. She was a very active participant and leader in the women's studies program, as well as in numerous other organizations for social justice. Shortly after graduation, on her way to law school, she was tragically killed in an automobile accident. And thanks to generous donations from her family and their friends, this lecture series honors Jessica's memory with high-profile lectures co-sponsored by the Center for Women that highlight the intersecting themes of gender, race, feminism, class, the law, and social justice in the United States. Please join me in recognizing Richard and Martha Glasser, who have flown in from Florida to be with us tonight.
Thank you. The second person we want to recognize is involved in the Allie P. Crown Endowment on Women's Roles in Culture and Society. The advisory board of the Center for Women at Emory, representing numerous donors, presented this endowment to Emory in 2008 in recognition of retired Center for Women Director Allie Crown for her years of service, leadership, and commitment to women at Emory. Will you please stand, Allie, and if everyone could recognize Allie Crown. We also want to give a special thanks to the many, many additional co-sponsors who've made this event possible. They are the Office of Community and Diversity, the Race and Difference Initiative, the Hightower Lecture Fund, Emory Graduate School, Emory Law School, the President's Commission on the Status of Women, the Transforming Community Project, the James Weldon Johnson Institute, the Departments of Psychology, Sociology, Philosophy, History, and African American Studies, Feminists in Action, our student organization, Alumni and Women of Emory, Spark Reproductive Justice Now, and Karis Bookstore. Finally, I want to thank Sasha Smith, Rosalind Sledge, and all of the many Emory volunteers who have made this event possible. And who have been running around here all day, trying to get ready for you guys. So thank you to everyone.
Before we begin, we'd like to remind you that personal cameras and other recording devices may not be used during the program, and also please be sure to turn off your cell phones and any other technology you might have on you. In case of emergency, there are exits at the front and the back of the sanctuary. And now we'd like to introduce Dr. Beverly Guy Sheftal, who obviously needs no introduction. She's, I'll just say she's the president of the National Women's Studies Association, and she's also the Anna Julia Cooper Professor of Women's Studies at Spelman College, and she will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Lynn. I am deeply honored to have been asked by my colleagues at Emory University, from which I graduated with a PhD, to introduce Angela Davis this evening. While I will be unable to capture in the time I have the extraordinariness of her life and work, and even if I had several hours, this would be the case, I will give it a try. I especially want to release Professor Davis from the iconic 60s construction of her as the angry, dangerous black woman with a large afro. With a large afro running from the FBI. Angela has been an uncompromising, ethical, relentless political activist involved in local and global struggles for human rights and progressive social change during her entire life. She has lent her radical black feminist voice to a variety of urgent social issues: racism, economic justice, poverty, prison reform, women's liberation, black liberation, homophobia, welfare reform, reproductive freedom, sexual violence, health, child care, public education, apartheid, peace, and nuclear disarmament. Her roots in Birmingham, Alabama, where she was born in 1944, helped to explain some of her political commitments and activisms. In the Angela Davis Reader, which Professor Joy James edited, there is an eloquent description of what Joy calls the formation of an activist intellectual. She grew up in the Jim Crow apartheid South in a neighborhood known as Dynamite Hill because of Ku Klux Klan terrorism, including bombings against Black families. Her activist mother, Sally Bell Davis, was a national officer and activist in the Southern Negro Youth Congress, which among other things campaigned to free the Scottsboro Nine. Angela's class consciousness and solidarities were evident at an early age. Because of her own family's relative material security, as a grade schooler, she took money from her father and gave it to her less well-off elementary school classmates so that they could buy lunch. Angela left the South in 1959 for Manhattan, New York, in part to escape Jim Crow and inadequate segregated public schools. Here she lived with a progressive white family and attended a private high school, Elizabeth Irwin Little Red Schoolhouse. While a student there, she studied Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto, and at age 15, became active in a youth organization associated with the Communist Party. After high school in New York, she went to Brandeis University on scholarship, where she studied with philosopher Herbert Marcuse, and went to the Sorbonne for her junior year abroad. It was in Paris that she learned of the September 15, 1963 bombing of Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church, which killed 4 little girls whom she knew: Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, Addie Mae Collins, and Denise McNair. After graduating from Brandeis, she spent 2 years at the Faculty of Philosophy at Goethe University in Frankfurt, West Germany, pursuing a doctorate. In 1967, she joined SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Black Panther Party. In 1970, she was arrested as a so-called co-conspirator in an abortive attempt to free George Jackson from a courtroom in Marin County, California, August 7, 1970, after having been, some of you may recall, on the FBI's most wanted list. She was acquitted June 4, 1972, of all those false charges after serving a prison term. From 1975 to 1977, she taught African American Studies at Claremont College, despite Ronald Reagan, the then governor of California, having stipulated that she should never be allowed to teach in any state-supported university. She later joined the faculty at San Francisco State University, where she taught women's studies and ethnic studies, and in 1979 visited the Soviet Union, where she was awarded the prestigious Lenin Peace Prize and made an honorary professor at Moscow University. Before her recent retirement, she was an endowed professor at the University of California at Santa Cruz in their famous History of Consciousness program. Over a long and distinguished academic career as a scholar activist, she has published a number of important texts. If They Come in the Morning, Voices of Resistance, co-edited with her friend and colleague Bettina Apteker, Angela Davis, an autobiography, 3 classics of Black feminist theory, Women, Race, and Class, Women, Culture, and Politics, and Blues, Legacy, and Black Feminism. And finally, her groundbreaking prison writings, including Are Prisons Obsolete? Her earlier landmark essay, Reflections on the Black Woman's Role in the Community of Slaves, written while she was in prison, helped to establish the interdisciplinary field of Black women's studies. Revisionist in approach, her essay debunks prevalent stereotypes about Black women, and unmasks androcentric biases in American history by calling attention to the scholarly neglect of the intellectual work and experiences of Black women. It rejects as well the conventional African American history paradigm that posits Black male experience as the norm and renders invisible, for example, Black female resistance to racial and gender oppression, including slavery. When the history of 20th century radical activism is written, when the history of feminist theory is written, when the history of African American intellectual and political history is written, when prisons are no longer the punishment of choice, Angela Davis's vision, scholarship, and activism will constitute an important part of that narrative. In our lifetime, she has been the quintessential role model for practicing what you preach, keeping the faith, and committing one's life to relieving the misery of others. Thanks, Angela, for all you have done and continue to do for people here and around the globe.
Well, first of all, thank you, Beverly, for the amazing introduction. And I see you have a lot of fans in the house. This may mean that Spellman is in the house this evening. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here in Atlanta again. And I would like to thank the Women's Center, the Center for Women and the Women's Studies Department at Emory for having made this event possible. And the Glazers for their contribution to the lecture series. As I should say to Reverend Warnock, who had to rush out to a trustee meeting, but he said he would be back, like any good Baptist minister. So I should say that as a person who grew up in the South, in Birmingham, Alabama, not very far from Atlanta. Atlanta was, of course, the big city for us in Birmingham. But as a person who followed and participated in the freedom movements of the 1950s and the 1960s, it is really a great honor to be here in Ebenezer Baptist Church. This is one of those historical sites inhabited by so many spirits of freedom. And so as I prepare to share some ideas with you this evening on the subject of women's history and the relationship of women's history to the prison crisis we face today, I should say that I think about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and I also think about Coretta Scott King. I think of all of the women, who made that movement possible. All of the women who have no names, whose names have not been preserved in the annals of history, but ordinary women who had a vision, who were able to imagine a different future. And when we think about the Montgomery bus boycott and as the event that allowed Dr. King to become a spokesperson for the freedom dreams of people who were racially oppressed, we rarely think about the anonymous people who did the work that made it possible for that movement to develop. And for this Women's History Month, I think we should find a way to conjure the maids and laundresses and cooks and domestic workers who were compelled to travel from their poor black neighborhoods to affluent white neighborhoods in Montgomery, and who were the ones who, when approached, said, yes, we will refuse to ride the bus. It's because of them that we are where we are today. We stand on their shoulders. Now, I should say that I indicated that I was very impressed by Beverly's introduction. I should tell you that I didn't realize she was going to introduce me, and last night I was saying to my assistant before she gave me the itinerary, I said, oh, I have to email, Beverly, because if I come to Atlanta without getting in touch with her, I will never hear the end of it. She said, well, she's going to be introducing you, so you will see her. So the month of March, as we know, has been designated as Women's History Month. And of course, we have Black History Month, although someone gave me a T-shirt the other day that says Black History is not a month. But there are very interesting stories behind the period selected to allow us to pay tribute to those who fought for racial equality, for black freedom, to those who fought for women's equality, for gender justice and gender freedom. The month of March was selected as Women's History Month because of the tradition of celebrating International Women's Day on March 8th. Now, what is often ignored in the evocation of Women's History Month and International Women's Day is the fact that the idea for such a celebration was initially to honor the labor struggles of working class women in the United States. As a matter of fact, first the Socialist Party named a date in February 1909. I mean, it would have actually been interesting if Women's History Month was February and Black History Month was February, and we would have been compelled to try to figure out all of the connections and intersectionalities. But eventually, International Women's Day, March 8th, became a day when people in the socialist and communist movements throughout the world paid tribute to the contributions of women. But not too many people in the US celebrated March 8th. It took a long time before that holiday even made it into the calendars. And now, of course, it's like many other holidays, it's an occasion for shopping. I happened to see on, one of those shopping channels, what do they call them? QVC or something like that, that they have International Women's Day specials, right? And I also really thought that Martin Luther King Day was destined to become yet another sale day. And I suppose we should thank all of the people, including our new president, Barack Obama, for emphasizing the celebration of that day by giving service, offering service to others. Yeah, we do have a new president, don't we? And his name is Barack Hussein Obama. I mean, I like to say that because you remember how extraordinary it sounded at first and we become more and more familiar. It becomes more and more familiar to us, and we forget how extraordinary we felt and how extraordinary it sounded. So we have to maintain some of that. And we also have to remind him that we remember that as well. But I'll see if I can talk a little bit about the present moment. But let me go back to my very brief summary of this month that we're celebrating now. In 1975, the United Nations began to celebrate International Women's Day. They also declared, the United Nations declared the year 1975 as International Women's Year. But soon it was recognized that 1 year was not nearly enough time to develop the strategies for changing structures of patriarchy and misogyny and male domination and all of the other intersecting modes of oppression, imperialism, and capitalism, and all of that. And so a number of NGOs within the United Nations argued that we need longer than a year. We need 10 years. And so 1975 to 1985 was designated International Women's Decade. Obviously we needed a little bit more than a decade also. But I mention this because this incredible conference took place in 1985 in Nairobi, Kenya. It was the first international women's conference that had ever taken place on the continent of Africa. And there was an enormous delegation from the US. For the very first time, a delegation that included huge numbers of women of color from the US. And, for some of you, I'm trying to get a sense of who is here and, age-wise, generation-wise, and I see this is a very diverse audience, which is wonderful. Generationally, culturally, racially. But as I think back to that period, I remember all of the debates that were going on with respect to the nature of feminism and women's issues, and was feminism a white woman's thing, or could Black women and women of color associate themselves with the campaign for gender equality? And many of us said, yes, we must, but gender does not stand by itself. To be a feminist involves not only a commitment for gender justice, but a commitment toward racial justice and class justice and sexual justice as well. And some of you may know, remember, or have studied historical memory doesn't require that you were actually alive when you remember something. So I always like to make that point. So you may remember the ways in which this notion of what we now often call intersectionality as a shorthand, how that developed. Well, in any event, this huge delegation goes to Kenya, armed with all of this sophisticated analysis about what it means to struggle for gender justice, gender equality, and all of the various intersectionalities that we have to attend to. And we had this amazing encounter with African women, with Kenyan women, because this was also the first international women's conference that was attended by huge numbers of women from Africa. and women from the global South in general. And so we were talking about intersectionalities and those kinds of questions, and a number of African women were saying, well, you know, for us, water is a feminist issue. Clean water is a feminist issue. Firewood is a feminist issue. And so that was a very humbling experience. We learned the extent to which our, rather provincial, albeit sophisticated notions of what counted as feminism, had to take a back seat, oftentimes, to some of the more important issues that involve saving lives. Now, when we celebrate Women's History Month, we usually look for individual names. We usually use that time to enumerate, all of the individuals who have made significant contributions to struggles for gender equality, right? I don't know, name some names. Okay. Absolutely. And did I hear Fannie Lou Hamer? Okay. I think Fannie Lou Hamer is especially important if we're talking about individuals, because without Fannie Lou Hamer, Barack Obama would have never been conceivable. And did I hear Joanne Robinson? Because I like to mention Joanne Robinson, who she wrote a book called The Montgomery Bus Boycott and the Women Who Started It. And I also like to think about Anne Braden. Anne Braden, a white woman from the South who gave her life to the struggle for racial justice. And if I had time, I would spend as much time as it might be required to talk about Fannie Lou Hamer or Joanne Robinson or Anne Braden, but you can look them up on the internet, right? And find out a bit more. Because what I want to emphasize once more at this point is the fact that massive numbers of women, and especially women of color whose names will probably be forever lost to history, were far more important to the movements we celebrate than the leaders or spokespersons. And what I want us to think about now is the collective imagination, the collective resistance that made all of these movements possible. But we don't necessarily know how to acknowledge those whose names we do not know. We know how to acknowledge individuals we can identify, but we don't necessarily know how to acknowledge communities, especially when we have no direct visual evidence of these communities, especially when we have to imagine them. And so in honor of Women's History Month, I want to make the point that the most important elements of women's history, and I would say, and Black history as well, are accessible to us only through the imagination. We have to be able to imagine communities in struggle. We have to be able to recognize that the most important figures in these struggles have been people whose deeds we have to imagine because they are rarely seen as deserving a place in recorded history. We haven't learned how to create a popular language that acknowledges the fact that gender never stands alone. It is always informed by other modes of oppression. And if you think about the fact that, that we were called upon to think about gender as an important social phenomenon, and we assumed that gender was binary, right? We assumed that there were two genders. And we think in those terms today. And institutional memory posits gender as binary. Now, what happens when you recognize that there are more than two genders, more than two gender identifications? When you talk about women, you have to also talk about transgender women. Or you have to talk about transgender men. Or you have to talk about gender nonconformists, those who don't necessarily identify as male or female. This makes many people uncomfortable. It makes people uncomfortable because the concepts with which we work allow us to feel as if we know our place in the world. And when we begin to trouble those notions, it affects us emotionally. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about that in relation to prison work, because I've been asked to talk about women and prison and privilege, and some of the most interesting and most exciting work that is happening in relation to prisons, and I should say some of the most exciting anti-prison work, or abolitionist prison work, is emerging from a new transgender consciousness. When you consider that we have these institutions, that we have these prisons, and more than 2.2 million people are behind walls, and they're all either male or female, right? They're gendering apparatuses, right? So what happens if you don't fit one or the other? Well, the prison system makes the decision for you. Will tell you where you belong, and you will belong either in a male prison or a female prison. But yeah, let me, before I get into some of the really serious themes of my presentation, let's smile again. And let's remind ourselves that this is the first Women's History Month since the election of Barack Obama. And also, since Michelle Obama became it's a new day. It is a new day. It's definitely a new day. And one of the major responsibilities we bear is to guarantee that some of these issues that are marginalized are become a part of the agenda of the new administration. You see, many people assume that the only way you can support someone like Barack Obama is agree with everything he says. And that is not good support. That's not the best way to support anyone. And one of the major both theoretical and activist strategies we discover within feminism is precisely that ability to work with contradictions, to make contradictions productive, to make them do work, rather than assume that you have to choose one thing or the other. You can either support the Obama administration, or you say you don't support him because you don't like his position on Afghanistan, which I definitely don't like. And you don't like the fact that there has not been the kind of acknowledgement of the imprisonment crisis that we need during this period. And so, yeah, let's talk about that issue. There are huge numbers of people in this country who are triply and quadruply rendered invisible because of their race, their gender, their sexuality, their disabilities, their status as prisoners. If we think about the many people behind bars, women, men, transgender populations, we recognize that a huge proportion of our national population is in prison. 1 out of every 100 adults. And last year, the Pew Center on the States released this report called 1 in 100. 1 out of every 100 adults is behind bars. I mean, it was interesting. I was in London right after the release of that report last year at an International Women's Day event that was sponsored by the Mayor of London. And I was sharing these astounding numbers, 1 in 100. And there were members of parliament at the event. There were quite a few people, and they really thought I had misspoken myself when I said 1 in 100 adults in the U.S. is behind bars. They thought I was talking about black people. They didn't realize. But this country is the great incarcerator. It has the largest incarcerated population in the world. But the point I want to make is that the Pew Center just released a new report. And the name of that report is 1 in 31, the long reach of American corrections. That is to say that 1 out of every 31 adults in this country is under the direct control of a corrections agency, either in prison or jail or on parole or probation. Now, can you believe that? Well, I know a lot of people should believe it because you know many of those men and women, right? Am I right? I mean, you have friends, you have relatives. And I should say that I'm very, very sad. I live in Oakland, California. And you probably heard about the most recent situation in Oakland, in my neighborhood. I've lived in East Oakland. I have lived in East Oakland since my trial was over. That's how I ended up in the Bay Area, because my trial took place up there, and then all my friends and family moved up there, so we ended up, staying in the Bay Area. But I've been living in East Oakland, not too far from where the 4 policemen were killed on Saturday. But when you think about the fact that 1 out of every 100 adults is subject to official punishment, how does this, hold on for a second, I need to get some water. Thank you. Now, if you look at how these numbers break down in relation to race and gender, it's kind of strange, the categories they use, but their statistical categories should say something to us as well. Women, that is to say women of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, 1 in 89. White people, that is to say white men and women, 1 in 45. Latinos, 1 in 27. Men of all racial backgrounds, 1 in 18. And black men and women together, 1 in 11. I mean, this is when I read this, it reminded me, of that wonderful anthology that was published, I think, in 1981. All the women are white, all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave. So there are statistical erasures that are happening here, right? And we know that if we break those down further with respect to black men, it's going to be something like, 1 in 5 or 1 in 4. 1 in 4, I believe. 1 in 4. So I'm, looking at all the brothers in the audience, that's you're the, one. But in any event, Marian Wright Edelman, who is an incredible woman, and we should celebrate her during Women's History Month. Marian Wright Edelman, who of course is the head of the Children's Defense Fund, has this program that is called Cradle to Prison Pipeline. And so recently she was interviewed and she says, well, if we don't stop the growing incarceration and criminalization of America, we're the world's leading jailer. It's going to be a disaster. It really is becoming the American apartheid. We're wasting in my view, but spending $60 billion to $70 billion a year on our prison system. It's a larger employer than General Motors, Walmart, or Ford, and states are stupidly spending 3 times more per prisoner than a school pupil, and that's a pretty dumb investment policy. So let's try to figure out what this crisis, one of the deep crises we confront today, the crisis of the punishment industry. Let's try to figure out what this has to do with women's history. What does it have to do with feminism? And I would say, first of all, that if you look at the history of the struggle for women's rights, you see that struggle has engaged either explicitly or implicitly with the system of punishment in this country. As a matter of fact, the history of the prison system reveals that it was a particular form of punishment that was not designed for women, so to speak. Imprisonment as punishment is a peculiarly democratic form of punishment. That is to say, imprisonment consists in the removal of rights and liberties that have to be acknowledged in a democratic society. Otherwise it would make no sense to have your freedom taken away from you if you don't have freedom in the first place. You see what I'm saying? So that is why the prison as the dominant mode of punishment only emerges with capitalist democracy. If you look at the whole history of this institution. And initially, women of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, especially women who especially married women, weren't recognized as having any particular rights. As a matter of fact, the husband always spoke for the wife, right? That's a symbolism of the wife losing her name, because she loses her legal personality, and her legal personality merges with that of the husband, who then is recognized before the law as the legal personality. So it's very interesting that that women didn't have too many rights to be taken away by prison. And at the same time, women were severely punished in ways that we don't necessarily connect with the prison system. Punished, as a matter of fact, if we want to ask ourselves why domestic violence is so pandemic, women were punished in the home. They were punished by the father, by the husband. However, in the 19th century, the late 1800s, the mid-1800s to the around 1870 or so, women's rights activists began to argue that women could also be punished by imprisonment. Now, you have to recognize that the notion of being punished in a prison was tied to rehabilitation. It was about being penitent and re-emerging as a better self, penitentiary. And so the argument was that women could not be rehabilitated, because when a woman committed a crime, it meant that she had fallen so far that she could never be redeemed. And so the women's rights activists began to argue that yes, women can be redeemed. They can be helped. They can be rehabilitated. But they ended up arguing that they needed a particularly gendered form of punishment and redemption. And so the women's prisons began to replicate domestic frameworks. So women went to prison and they learned how to cook and sew and be a good wife and a good mother. And it's always been very clear to me that these women were actually being trained to become servants. You know, it wasn't really about becoming better mothers and better wives. It was about becoming servants. But anyway, the institution of the prison, if you look at the way in which it is to some of the major questions that the women's movement has taken up over the years. Look at violence against women. We were talking about violence against women. Look at sexual assault. Now, we don't often think about institutions as agents of sexual assault. But if you look at some of the routine modes of violence in women's prisons especially, and I say women's prisons because women go to prison having already endured private violence, privatized violence, and then they endure the institutional violence, state violence. They endure strip searches and cavity searches, vaginal searches, and rectal searches. And then when you think about the extent to which that is connected to other modes of institutional violence, you see that the institution of the prison encourages institutional violence in schools, for example. There was an article today in the New York Times about a 13-year-old girl who was strip searched by school administrators because someone had told them that she had some, what was it, Tylenol or something? Ibuprofen. Oh, you read the article. Okay. That's right, not acetaminophen, ibuprofen. You know, I have no idea what, that people get high on ibuprofen or, but anyway, the administration was concerned about drugs in the school, and they forced this 13-year-old to take off every stitch of clothing, to bare her breast, to open her legs. This was at a school in Arizona. And this is something that women in prison undergo every day, all the time. It's considered the norm. Now,
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.